Hi, everybody. In this video, I'm going to review the 6 questions on test 1. It'll take some time to do all 6 questions, so I guess I should warn you that this is not a short video. But it will save us time if we can do this in a video recording rather than take an entire class period to do that. So we'll use this technique. With that, I'm going to bring up a list of questions. Frankly, the first question. See if we can do that. Here we are. This is the first question on the test, and it's about corporate mission. You should have figured out that the answers to this question could be obtained from lecture number 1. The questions are: what's a corporate mission? How do you know a mission's been stated completely? How are top corporate managers and the directors influenced by the mission? Based on our discussion in class, does GE have a mission? And then describe the mission that you and your teammates of the company that you and your teammates are studying. I won't get into that last one because it differs between the 3 teams, but we can sure talk about the other 4 questions. First of all, what's a corporate mission? So let me close this slide and see if I can come up here. This is the hard part. I've got to choose the correct slide, and I sometimes have difficulty doing that. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm having difficulty. What I'll do is I'll stop that, and I will. All right, so I think at this point I know how to find that lecture. Here we go for the lecture slides. So here are the slides from lecture 1. And if we go to slide number 3, really early on in the presentation, here's the definition. The mission describes the industry and the firm. In this case, we're interested in the firm's economic function in society. It's like a social contract. And then we can move on to discuss the mission in just about any way you want, as long as you get that first idea. And of course, later on in question 2, I'll ask you what the purpose of strategic planning is. And of course, it's to accomplish the mission. That's why we do strategic planning. In any event, the first question was, what's a corporate mission? And of course, it's to accomplish the economic function and economic function for society. It's like a social contract. The second question then was, how do you know that a mission has been stated completely? And in fact, I've given you a model to do that with, and it's Abel's model, which asks these 3 questions. What segment of society or market is the firm going to serve? What in that market are in that market, what are the customers' unmet needs? Because if we don't know of any, then there may not be a need for another firm if we're thinking about getting into an industry. And most importantly of all, what distinctive competence will be required to meet that need? Now, students sometimes, and there were a couple in this class, answered by stating that the way you know is by answering who, what, and how. And that's just not good enough. Who, what, and how are easy to remember. So I've offered them to you as a way of jogging your memory regarding the actual questions that have to be answered to know that you've got a good, a complete mission, mission completely stated. The third question was how the top corporate managers and the directors, how are they influenced by the mission? And let me stop sharing here for a minute. There we go. This was a sort of an open-ended question. You could go at it more than one way for credit. The mission, as the lecture went on, was acknowledged as a basis for deciding the scope of acceptable goals and strategy. Quite a bit of the conversation in the lecture was focused on vision, and the mission is a basis for vision. One person answered this question in addition to mentioning those points about the basis for vision, also talked about the agency problem. The mission defines how a firm is going to perform an economic function for society, and society consists of stakeholders. And so the problem is that different stakeholders, whether it's the government, society at large, employees, suppliers, customers, and so forth, they can have conflicting interests. And so depending on how management sees the mission, its selection of goals and strategy will differ. So this was kind of one of those questions where you can kind of take your own point of view, but you have to have a point of view, and you have to refer to what was in the lecture, of course. Another question was asked based on our discussion in class, does General Electric have a mission? I can bring up the slide here that we used to talk about General Electric, and it's, there we go, here we are. And you can see that General Electric is in just quite a wide variety of industries. Now, since this slide was prepared way back in 2010, GE has gotten out of some of these industries because it was just too widespread, and couldn't concentrate its resources adequately to do a good job in just about all of them, or any of them. And in fact, back in 2010, GE had just divested NBC, the broadcasting company. So the answer to this question is no. Because it's so widespread, GE certainly does not have a mission. But each of those individual businesses within General Electric has a mission. In the course and lecture one, I pointed out that there are some companies some conglomerates that own multiple businesses, they do have missions because the businesses that they own are related to each other, and the parent company can provide common resources, such as research and development. I think an example that I gave in the lecture was 3M Corporation, where 3M provides lots of laboratory resources that individual businesses within 3M just could not afford. So let's see, that's General Electric, and I guess that's pretty much it for question number one. So let me bring up the questions again and we can move on. And at the same time, just acknowledge that we got this one taken care of. There we go. So that's question one. The corporate mission, Abel's model, the guidance that the mission provides, and most importantly, mission provides the basis for top management vision, what it's trying to make the company become in the future. And then General Electric, no, it's too diversified, too spread out. So that corporation doesn't have a mission, but its businesses do. Okay, this takes us to question 2, and that is strategic planning. This is, we just saw the purpose of strategic planning in a slide that we looked at a moment ago. But the purpose of strategic planning is to accomplish the mission. Now there are lots of, there's more to the answer. One person, for instance, said the purpose was to spell out all the activities in the 3 stages of strategic planning. That got partial credit, but the essence, the real, the reason why we're doing strategic planning is because management wants the firm to accomplish what the firm is there for in the first place, what its purposes are. Back we can go to the slides of lecture 1 real quick, if I can find it. There we are. And I guess here we can go back up to question 3 real quick and just remind ourselves that the purpose of comprehensive strategic planning is to accomplish the mission. Then, what are the stages of strategic planning? And there actually, there's an answer to that in these 2 slides. First of all, once we've gotten the mission acknowledged, and in the lecture I pointed out that the mission is not part of strategic planning. It's the foundation, the justification for strategic planning, or the purpose. There are 3 basic stages: to acquire decision-making evidence, make decisions, and implement strategy. And each one of those stages breaks down into 2 parts. Gathering evidence consists of gathering evidence about the external environment and internal capabilities. Decisions break down into goals and strategy, and later on in the course I explained that in fact there's something in between these 2, which is the selection of strategic objectives. I've got strategic objectives in item 2B here because at this early stage I did not want to get into the distinction between strategic objectives and strategy. But in order to accomplish the goals, we're going to have certain objectives such as low cost or superior quality, or a certain strong market share in some particular market segment. And based upon those objectives, then we'll develop the work, all the work and concept that management selects to accomplish the goals, and its rationale for selecting that approach rather than alternatives. So that's, the second stage actually has, you could say it has 3 steps, but in this case, the second step includes both the objectives of strategy and then strategy itself. And finally, stage 3, implementation. includes defining, framing out the work in detail in the form of projects and programs, and then staying on top of it to exert oversight, to maintain control and replan as necessary. So the third question is, what benefits has strategic planning been shown to convey to corporations, and what are some of the pitfalls? And in fact, we got into some of the pitfalls when we talked about these cognitive biases, such as escalating commitment, hubris, groupthink, that sort of thing. But in fact, let me just turn off the slide here and come back with you. There was another part of the lecture where there were two general categories of benefits described. Affirmative benefits are the benefits that come along with the fact that firms that do strategic planning perform better financially and competitively than firms that don't do strategic planning. And those that plan well by following the methodological principles of strategic planning, many of which we'll cover in this course, do better than those who do planning but don't do it as well, don't follow those principles. Like then those that don't do a good job at strategic planning don't do as well as those who do, who plan well. There's another category of benefits, and they're protective. It's like insurance. Doing strategic planning is expensive. It takes people, it takes resources, it takes time, and you kind of wonder whether it's worth all the trouble. And early on in the textbook, you read about how Henry Mintzberg argued that strategic planning might not be worth the time because the world is so unpredictable and so volatile that it's difficult to do a forecast that comes true. Nevertheless, management does have to exercise its best judgment, and based on that judgment, it will make commitments of capital that will be long-lasting. And of course, if management really were to proclaim that it had no idea of the future, then it would probably not be justified in committing capital, and yet it does so every day. So there's a certain protective benefit of strategic planning because it minimizes risk. It reduces the chances that a firm will make a mistake and get caught unaware. And I think, in fact, there's a slide that we looked at in the lecture. Let me see if I can find it for you, even though I'm now taking more time than I thought I would. But yeah, here we are. I made the point that over time, the non-planners will fall away because they get caught by such things as recessions or market downturns, what have you. And so as a result, the planners may not grow as fast during the boom times as the non-planners, but the planners are more likely to be prepared for challenges as well as opportunities. And so over the long run, they will grow with the industry, and eventually the non-planners will get weeded out. That's those are the benefits of strategic planning. There was one other risk aside from those biases that I talked about in the lecture, and that's impedance. Sometimes firms, because they do a bad job of planning, they don't select the right planning methods. The planning can do what Mintzberg was talking about. It can bog the company down. It can get so complicated, or even take a company in the wrong direction because it's not using the right method of strategic planning. The result is unfortunate. And frankly, that's why strategic planning consultants like myself and the multitude of consultants and consulting firms all over the world earn a pretty good living by helping top management be sure that they have the most modern and appropriate strategic management methods. And by appropriate, I mean methods that are appropriate for their firms. Just think, just use a little common sense here. Can you really imagine that the strategic planners in a bank and a banking corporation are going to do strategic planning the same way the strategic planners in a steel corporation? Or perhaps a high technology company like a medical products company? You know, there's strategic planning and the methods that are used are going to differ depending upon the kind of industry that it's done in. And those differences are not well understood, even by folks who proclaim to be experts in strategic planning. So you don't see any recognition in your textbook or any others that I'm aware of that strategic management methods have to differ between industries. And yet it is certainly true that indeed methods, appropriate methods, really do differ between industries. So let me now move to question 3. That's assuming I can get back here to the questions. And there they are. So question 3, Porter's 5 forces. What's the purpose of Porter's 5 forces? And I hope you know the answer to that question, but we'll see it in just a minute. It's to assess the profit potential of an industry, not a company, but an industry. What exactly are those 5 forces? How should the analyst report the 5 forces? And we had a little exercise on that in class. I even provided you with some supplemental slides on that particular item. What should strategists do in response to the analysis? And then I asked you to do a table of 5 forces for the industry that you and your teammates are studying. So let me see if I can bring up here, if I can, a slide, a series of slides on the 5 forces. There they are. Okay, so here are those 5 forces. By the way, I can show them to you in this diagram probably just as easy. The most basic one is the intensity of rivalry, current rivalry among firms that are in the industry today. And then there are 4 other forces that can modify that force and its impact on profit potential of an industry. And they are the risk of new entrants into the industry, the bargaining, the threat of substitutes by services or products offered in other industries, the bargaining power of your customers, the buyers, and the bargaining power of your suppliers. Those are the 5 forces. We've now talked about the purpose and the description. How do we go about let's see, how should the analyst report results of a five forces analysis? And you may remember seeing these slides that I sent to you. And these slides were actually prepared by students in some of my courses. So we could just summarize them like this. We could make a bar chart. And as I recall, I think three of you used this technique to show me that you know how to report the results of a five forces analysis. This is probably the slickest and the best method of all. Frankly, using this plus this is the best method of all. But a table that summarizes the forces ranked on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is low, 5 is high, is the best way. To the extent that the total or average score is high, then the pressures on profitability are high and the profit potential of the industry is low. So in this case, in this example, the team who prepared this slide, and I want to repeat again, this was done by one of the teams in one of my courses. So this is not the kind of work that you can't do yourself. Other people just like you have done it. But you can see that in this example, the differences in profit potential are pretty narrow. But in this industry, the US and China had the strongest forces pressing profit down. So it was tougher to make a good profit margin in those two countries than it was in, for instance, Mexico, where the forces pressing profit down were weaker. And as I recall, this happened to be the cement industry. Don't hold me to that, but I think this is the analysis of CEMEX, the cement mex, the Mexican cement manufacturing company. And that's what I think. That's what this this slide was meant to show: profit potential, the five forces influence on profit potential of the cement industry in these 6 countries. So you might give that some thought as you're beginning. You should be far past beginning work on your project in this course. Okay, so this takes us now to global market differences. And here I confess that there was a flaw in the exam. I'm a human being and I make mistakes too, and I made a mistake here. And I think in class I admitted my mistake, and I'm going to admit it for you here again. So let me just come on back to the questions, and we'll get to that one. That's assuming I can make it come up. There we go. Whoops, let's see. This is age groups. Pardon me. I don't think we're at the one where I screwed up yet. Where I screwed up will come later. Is that true? Yeah. I screwed up on question 5, not question 4. Here, we're talking about age groups and demographic trends and shifts in US age groups. And age groups themselves are markets and market segments. There was a purpose to this question, and I was surprised that nobody tumbled to it. Nobody got the idea of what was going on here. And I'll try to show it to you with some slides. But I basically asked for demographic shifts before and after 2010, which age groups represented the largest markets and the smallest, which the fastest and which the slowest. and then to talk a little bit about drivers of those shifts. And the big driver, frankly, was simply the birth rate. But let me now stop sharing this slide with you and see if I can get the slide that has the information about age groups. I think it's this one. It sure is. Okay. But I have to come up to the top. Okay. So before by the way, you needed to look at these two slides, which show essentially up to 2009 and and then beginning at 2010, we see different growth patterns in these age groups. As you can see, in pardon me. Before 2009, the fastest age group was the 45 to 64-year-old group. Before that, with about a 15-year lag, it was the 25 to 44-year-old group. This group, 15 years later, is that group, is the 45 to 64, right? They're the same ones. In any event, the fastest growing group were 45 to 64. Not the seniors. You know, the seniors are really moving along, but this is frankly the baby boom. And the baby boom, this is the same group of folks when these people were 20 years younger. So this is the baby boom, and then later on, this is the baby boom as we move through time. And the largest group, certainly before 2010, was the 25 to 44. And the fastest group was the growing group was the 45 to 64-year-old group. After 2010, we can see that something really is happening, and that is that these 45 to 64-year-olds back here, okay, these folks are now the seniors, and they are growing fast. And right here in this period is where we are today, and their population is growing the fastest of all. The biggest is still the 25 to 44-year-old group because they're coming in behind in the next generation. But the 45 to 64, these are no longer the baby boomers. This is after the baby boomers, when we started to get into some rough economic times, and and folks simply quit having babies as fast. And that's an important point. And it is that these market segments that are comprised of different age groups of people will differ in size over time. And folks in these different age groups have different needs, don't they? So the seniors have much different needs than these 25 to 44-year-olds. The 45 to 64, they're not growing very much, but they've got a lot of extra cash in their pocket, right? Their kids have gone to school. They're at their peak earning years, probably saving money, prone to take vacations, that sort of thing. The 25 to 44-year-olds are probably maybe buying a house for the first time, or maybe moving into a second house because they need more bedrooms and so forth. So age groups and their market opportunities differ over time. So here then is a summary. The largest age group moved from the 45 to 64s to the 25 to 44s. Fastest growing 45 to 64 before, seniors after, right? And these are the same folks. These are the same people. That's the point. These are the same people. The slowest growing age group back in before 2010 was 25 to 44. They were actually declining. And now, lo and behold, later when they're older, they're still declining. But now they're the 45 to 64-year-old group. So what I tried to give you a chance to confront here was the transition of age groups, populations over time. To be honest with you, I could have made it a little easier to figure this out or to realize it as you were answering the question. If you did not recognize that these were the same groups, I didn't take any points off. You weren't penalized. But I did hope that you'd sort of appreciate that. The last question was on the drivers of shifts between market segment shifts. And we talked about a whole bunch of them during the first part of this course. Marriage trends, of course, would have a direct bearing on birth rates. Birth rates, of course, are important. The population of seniors and the fact that we old folks are living longer. And then people, there was a slide that showed the number of people 15 to 18 living with their parents, and that differed quite a lot. It was smallest in Canada. I think it was largest in Italy. But depending upon where you are in the world, this market of young consumers will differ a great deal in so far as what their demands are. Other possible answers that you could have discussed would be obesity trends, which is, as we pointed out, is shortening life expectancy in the United States for the last couple of years. Life expectancy in the US has actually come down a little bit. One reason happens to be obesity. We also talked about the agricultural market, and we saw farm sizes are getting larger, so there are fewer people on farms. Talked about airline route trends. So there were just all sorts of options that you could have chosen to discuss drivers of consumer market shifts. And then finally, I think I asked where in the United States consumer markets were growing faster and slower. And the point that we talked about in class was that the Sun Belt, it's not just because the Sun Belt is sunny. It's because in the Sun Belt, we've got a more favorable climate for industry. Some of the regulations, some of the laws are more favorable to industry. Frankly, unionization is not as intense as highly developed in the Southeast and the Southwest and on the West Coast as it is in the Midwest and the Northeast. So it's in the Sun Belt, generally speaking, that we find more people who are under 45 because there's more opportunity for them to be employed. And the proportions of people who are not young isn't as great in most cases. And that's simply because, and there's an exception, and you can see Cape Coral and Fort Myers, Florida. That's because of retirement. But generally speaking, the folks who are older simply are, if they have been born and they already were living in the Sun Belt, then they don't have to migrate in. But in the Sun Belt, what we have is the immigration of lots of people who want to go to work. When we go to the bottom of this chart, we see what is often called the Rust Belt. And this is old by and large. There are some exceptions. New Orleans, which had the problem, of course, with the hurricane. But the young adults have moved out of the old industrial regions of this country because those regions have declined along with their industries. And as a result, young adults have moved from those regions to the Sun Belt, where there are employment opportunities to make money, feed your family, and send them to school. Life is better in the Sun Belt. Notice the high proportions of folks who are over 45 in those regions, because once they're there, it's kind of hard to move out when you get to that age. So, and we did have a pretty good discussion about this in class. A couple of folks handled this question real well. Some folks just forgot all about it. Okay, so the next item is question number 5, and this is where I am embarrassed because I made a mistake. The mistake that I made, quite honestly, is to ask some of the questions here that would have been more appropriate for my course on international strategy and international commerce. I'm teaching both courses at the same time. And as you know, things have been a little frantic for faculty this semester because of all the changes. At least that's my excuse. So since we were talking about population and I was making up the questions, when I put the last 3 bullets here, I very honestly was thinking about a different course. As I explained in class, if you didn't get the answers to those last 3 questions right, no points were deducted at all. And you have my apology for asking them in the first place. On the other hand, it's not too hard to figure out or not too hard to get the answers to those questions. And a couple of the members of our class just must have jumped on Google or something, but gave me the answers. And I wanted to recognize those people, so I gave them extra credit points when they got those answers correct. So no points off, but if you happen to have done a good job on those last 3 questions, then you might have gotten a little something, you would have gotten a little something more. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to again bring up a slide to see if I can move through these answers a little more expeditiously. And I guess it's this one. We'll do this one first. Okay. At least I hope so. All right, so let's see. What which of the world's major economies or regions have the largest economies? And we certainly did go through that, and no doubt about it, it's the China and the U.S. unless you took into account the European Union. And the European Union's economy is larger than the U.S. economy. The black bars indicate 2018. The orange bars are the International Monetary Fund's forecast for 2024. So in the upper left-hand chart, you can see just how much larger China's economy is and how much larger it's going to get, even than the European Union, and certainly larger than the United States. Now, something interesting is going on, and that is that there's another country where there's some pretty fast growth going on. You can see here India, and it looks like its bar is almost going to double. That's, it goes from, I think, 10, see if we can find it, from 10, I've got billions here, but it should be trillions of dollars, not billions. That's terrible. I don't know whether I can fix that now. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, the U.S. has last year at about a $21 trillion economy. By 2024, almost 26. But China's economy last year, when we're doing purchasing power parity, which is the right way to report GDP, so they're comparable, was 25 trillion, expected to go to 40 trillion. And then here we are, India's moving from 10 trillion to 18 trillion, an increase of 84%. That's the fastest growth on this chart. You can see the growth rates up here. These are the compound average growth, compound annual growth rates. So the average annual growth rate of India is expected to be faster even than China. So the growth economy of the world among those that are developed is India and China. And as we will see in another chart, China's is the most interesting because that country is a lot wealthier than India. Notice that there's one other bar that is growing pretty fast here in terms of compound annual growth, and that's the 5 ASEAN nations. There are 10 nations in the ASEAN group, but the ASEAN 5 are the first 5, the most important for economic purposes. They're Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and who am I forgetting? Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. So those 5 together make up the core of the big Southeast Asian economies. And they are also growing very rapidly, especially Indonesia. To move down here, you can see, and I think that this question said which ones also have, question 3, which have the largest population. Of course, we know from our discussion in class that China's population is about 1.4 billion. India's is just underneath it. And as I've told you in class, I think that the statistical recording functions in India are a little sluggish, and that if an accurate count were made, India may already be as big as China. What's most impressive here, of course, is that India and China have populations that dwarf the other populations on this chart, on this exhibit, very often Russia is overestimated. Russia is a concern in the world because it's a nuclear power, but it's not an economic power. And we'll see that in the, I think we saw that. Is Russia here? Yeah, we can see that Russia, it's the smallest economy on this chart, isn't it? And although it's not growing any faster than the US or Europe, even though it has lots of growth potential, but frankly, its politics and its government structure and the way that government operates just keeps it from growing economically. And its population is smaller than the others here. If we take each nation's GDP, which was up on that earlier chart, and divide it by the population in 2018, we get the kind of answers that you're used to hearing about. The US is by far the wealthiest country. There's a lot more consumer spending power here in terms of GDP per capita. The European Union would come second, and Russia, because it does have it's more mature. It comes in third, but a distant third. It's half. Its wealth is on a per capita basis is less than half of the U.S. And then we have China, and it's less than a third. But we saw that China is growing rapidly, and so is India. You can see how low India's GDP per capita is. This is only $7,500 per capita compared to $18,000 in China, $43,000 in the European Union, and $62,000 in the US, and 30 in Russia. So lots of catching up yet to do here. So there was a question, I think, about which countries are the wealthiest. We didn't cover this in our course. I think one person in our class decided to go out and find out. I was very impressed by that. That's a person who obviously enjoys responding to a challenge, and in my estimation, for that reason, probably has a good professional career in the future. Finally, GDP per capita. Oh, that's what this table is. It just, I didn't have to go up here. I could have just read it from the table for you. Here's another question. And the reason I'm showing you these charts is to give you the answers. Since you saw the questions, I just felt you were entitled to know the answers to the questions, even though we didn't cover them in the course. And again, I'm sorry that I asked you questions that you couldn't answer, even though a couple students in our class did go find. I didn't get this kind of data from one person, or two people, but I did get a couple questions on the infrastructure development. But there's if you look at the IMF database, for every country, you will find the gross national saving rate. And it's essentially the sum of personal saving and corporate profits. Corporate profits are just saving, right? It's revenue less costs and expenses. That's profit. Less income taxes, that's net income. For you individually, your savings are your income less your expenses, and what's left over is your saving if you have any. At your age, you probably don't have much saving, but I hope in the future you will. In any event, corporate profits are just like saving, and if you add personal saving and corporate profits, you get gross national saving. And if you divide that by gross domestic profit, you'll get the gross national saving rate. And that rate is a reflection and indicator of funds that are available for reinvestment in the country's infrastructure and otherwise. Essentially, the growth to reinvest in the nation and the nation's growth. So where do you see the gross national saving rate the highest? And lo and behold, there it is in China. We see that the ASEAN group and Russia also have some pretty substantial gross national saving rates. ASEAN, that certainly is reflective of the economic growth in the ASEAN countries. In Russia's case, it's, I visited Russia last year, and I can tell you that not a whole lot of internal growth is going on. So I believe that this probably is more reflective of investment in Russia's military resources and its military endeavors around the world. Remember, it's a small economy. So although its saving rate is high, the amount of capital available for growth would still be relatively low. And we know that Russia's spending a lot of its resources to fund military endeavors in North Africa and the Middle East. So regrettably, Russia's gross national saving rate isn't being used for the kind of thing that we see happening in China and India and the ASEAN group. Also, if you haven't noticed, take a look at the lowest rate on this chart, and you'll get some ideas about why China's economy is growing so much faster than the US economy is growing. As I said, it wasn't necessary to provide this information. If we'd have discussed this stuff in the class, it would have been, but sadly, we didn't. So let me get back here now to the questions. And there they are. Okay, so we could certainly answer the question about the largest economies, and those are China and the US, or perhaps China and Europe, the European Union. Fastest growth, no doubt about it, China. India is growing rapidly, so is the ASEAN group. So where's the action happening here? Where's the growth? It's in Asia, isn't it? It's not in the Western Hemisphere. It's in the Eastern Hemisphere. Largest population, China and India, right? Those three questions you should have been able to answer. Now, fastest population growth potential, it's India and China. Wealthiest, the US. Strongest consumer markets, the US, Europe, again, ASEAN. Highest potential for infrastructure development, China, no question about that. Again, if you happen to get any of these three questions, if you happen to do a little research and give me the answer, and you were correct, I gave you credit. If you took a flyer, gave me an answer, and you were incorrect, you got no points off. If you didn't answer these three questions, you got no points off. The only thing that could have happened to you with these three questions is that you get some extra points. Okay, that takes us then to the last question on the internet. There were three questions. This was not a question. I don't know whether I can. Yeah, I can. There. List and describe the internet's dimensions, discuss problems as a strategy implementation mechanism, and then which of Porter's 5 forces have been affected. So let me see if I can find a slide to discuss this last question. And oh, by the way, I forgot to show you one slide. Let me on the last. I didn't show you this before, but these are the growth potentials. I didn't mention this when we were talking about the last question, but these are the expected growth, are the growth rates from 2000 to 2018. That's the black chart, black bar, and then the expected growth rate from 2010 to 18. And here you can see where India's growth rate actually picks up a bit because China is so large, it just can't keep growing at that rate, but its compound annual growth rate, even into the next decade, will be, right now, the growth rate is only about 6.5%. But if you start at 2000, oh, I'm sorry. I'll get it right if it kills me. If we look at 2010 to 2018, the decade that just passed, the growth rate was almost 11%. If we extend that all the way back to 2000, we can see that the growth rate has been faster, but even in the past decade, the growth rate has been over 10%. We can see that India's growth rate is picking up a little, but still over 10%. And then here's that ASEAN group that I was talking about earlier, and you can see that it's really picked up. Notice that the Commonwealth of Independent States, the largest country of which is Russia, we anticipate a substantial decline in growth. And by the way, when I say we, I mean the International Monetary Fund, very good economists. Here in the US, we expect a little faster growth. European Union and Japan, not really growing too fast. Okay, so now that you've seen that, I can move on to talking with you about the last question, which is the internet. And I'm going to try to find the internet. Okay, I had to look for the slide, and it turned out that it was right in front of me. Let me bring it up for you now. So here we have these are the questions on the internet. Let's get to the answers. So here were the 5 dimensions of the strategic dimensions of the internet, according to your author, John Parnell. And you can find these on pages 86 to 88 of your textbook. I won't bore you by reading them or going over all of them, just because I think they're pretty self-explanatory. I do think that it's important to appreciate the fact that speed refers to a lot of things, and yet in the textbook it just says speed, and you get a pretty brief discussion. But it's the speed of all these other things we're talking about: environmental scanning, the speed of transactions, the speed at which intangibles such as stock market ownership or just information that you buy is distributed, and the speed of interactivity between buyers and with themselves, buyers with sellers, sellers with sellers, which of course moves toward information symmetry. So these things are interrelated, aren't they? It's because of this interactivity that there's this movement toward the symmetry of information but throughout the distribution channel. And because of all of these things, there are much greater opportunities to reduce cost and shift cost through, among other things, outsourcing and the use of partners and alliances. And Parnell is a young guy. It's amazing that a young guy was able to write this book, but he's a young guy, and so he's pretty impressed by the internet, and he sees the formation of alliances and partnerships as taking on almost substituting for the role in the economy that firms used to play. There are new forms of firms. So that was the first question anyway, just to list and describe the internet's strategic dimensions. The second question was to discuss problems using the internet as a mechanism, as a strategy implementation mechanism. How does it facilitate information synchrony between suppliers and buyers? And of course, we've just finished talking about that. How does it stimulate value chain aggregation and disaggregation? If you turn to page 85 in your textbook, you'll find a good description of that. I can get rid of this slide for a minute, but the supply chain, or sorry, not the supply chain, but the value chain is the value chain, a concept described by Michael Porter that simply starts with the design of a product, for instance, and then the aggregation of its component parts, maybe production of components or purchasing them, later on assembling them into a product, distributing, marketing, and selling, after the sale service. So you have a chain at each stage of which value is added from the very outset, the inception, all the way to the delivery to the customer. That's the value chain. So the point that Parnell makes in the book is that with the internet, it's possible for each one of these stages to be performed by an independent company, and yet interrelated, coordinated electronically, so that an alliance or a partnership acts as if it is a single company. Now, not everybody would agree with that. And briefly, the textbook points out that one very famous guy who doesn't agree is Michael Porter. And if Porter doesn't agree, you better think about it. And I don't agree either, by the way. Maybe it's because we're both old guys. But it certainly is true that the value chain can be disaggregated through outsourcing, and that outsourcing can be coordinated and managed much better through electronic devices that we have today that we didn't have in the past. And then Parnell just ties it all together and says, and then we have reaggregation, where we not only can take things out of the value chain and do them outside the main value chain, but then put them back in to coordinate all that, again, electronically. And that's the concept of reaggregation. And it's this notion of reaggregation that enables Parnell to say, you see, this new world we live in, full of partnerships and alliances, has created new forms of enterprise that take the place of, that substitute the conventional notion of a firm. Porter again says, no, look, these are very powerful, interesting devices that have facilitated transactions, but a firm is a firm is a firm. And you know, the fact that we're able to integrate firms with each other doesn't mean that firms themselves don't exist, let alone comport to the rules of strategic management. And so that's the current issue. So the last question then is, how does it affect commoditization? And the point made by Parnell is that firms, because they can do so much tailoring using the internet, using all of the technology that we have today, they can create so many options, so many variations of products and services that frankly, the buyer, the customer, just gets confused. When that happens, the buyer reverts to something simpler and makes a decision based upon a particular category of features or quality, and eliminates a lot of detail that could be taken into consideration. And at that point, the products become commodities again because they all have these more modern, timely features. And as that happens, as competitive advantage gets competed away, we're in the world, back in the world of commoditization, where all products have essentially the same features for the purpose of making a buying decision. And since they all have essentially the same features, what does the buyer make a buying decision on? Price. And so at that point, the nature of competition reverts to low cost. After differentiation first is achieved, then everybody gets differentiated. Now nobody's differentiated, and we're back to competing on the basis of low cost. It's an interesting argument, and that is Parnell's argument. So let's see. The last item of question 6 is, based on your answers to questions 2 and 3, which of Porter's 5 forces has been affected by the internet? I will not drag you through a discussion of all 5 of Porter's forces that push down profit potential. However, I can tell you, and remember it's profit potential of an industry, and but what I can tell you is that all 5 of Porter's 5 forces are affected by the internet. One person in particular did a beautiful job of handling this, and just I should have just had his test here and read the answer. He could have written the book on this thing, but it all comes back to this information symmetry stuff. If everybody's got the same information about each other's rival, then if all rivals have the same information, rivalry is at its maximum, right? If buyers have all the information they possibly could have about their rivals, then or if suppliers do, then the buyer gains buying power. Conversely, if the buyers have as much information as they can possibly have about their suppliers, then the buyer can buy most advantageously just by trading off quality and price, trading competing suppliers off that way. Similarly, if there's plenty of information about alternative devices to meet demand that are available in other industries, then the intensity of the threat of substitutes increases, and so on. The threat of new entrants is affected because potential new entrants have access to all the information they could possibly need about the profit potential of this industry and make a decision whether it's a good one to get into or not. So the answer to this question is all 5. All 5 forces are affected by the internet. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our review, a rather lengthy one, I'm sorry, of the 6 questions in this test number 1. My sincere apology for putting questions in, what was it, question number 5 that we had not discussed in the course. My mistake, my mea culpa, shame on me. For those of you who took the trouble to go find answers anyway, I salute you for your industriousness. But the best thing I can do now is end this video so that you can either go to the bathroom or go get another cup of coffee or maybe even go back to work. And I'll see you in class. And with that, let me see if I can stop this video. Goodbye.